Let's talk about your speech yesterday. I mean, I thought it was a significant intervention. I mean, you said you weren't a politician, but you mentioned American leadership, Russian leadership. Now you're no longer a working royal, and heaven knows there's been enough comment about that over the years. Do you feel like emboldened? The shackles are off, free to say things about the world you couldn't say before 2020?
Look, I think the Overton window has shifted somewhat over the last 5 years, and I think that at the same time, it's what would worry me is if we live in a world where anyone in my position or anybody anywhere can't speak about the very things and the realities that we're seeing, and to hold those in leadership positions accountable, but also be able to try to encourage more support where support is needed. So I think there's a lot to be done. As far as shackles, from my perspective, we need to be collectively, as a global community, we need to feel empowered to be able to speak truth to power. It's really that simple. It's bad enough in today's world feeling gagged and saying that you can't say these things and can't say that, and that everything becomes political. I fundamentally disagree with that. What we are witnessing and what we are seeing is a humanitarian catastrophe in multiple parts of the world, and people are speaking up, and people will continue to speak up, and I would encourage more people to do the speaking up, because, as I said, the vast majority of people want to see an end to these conflicts and an end to this endless division that is largely being created online.
Harry, do you recognise that phrase, not a working royal? I mean, it strikes me, you're obviously from the royal family, you're here doing a trip, bringing attention to a really important cause that risks being forgotten. Do you recognise that description of you?
No, I will always be part of the royal family, and I'm here working and doing the very thing that I was born to do, and I enjoy doing it. I enjoy being able to do these trips and come and support the people that I've met before, the friends that I've made, and hopefully bringing attention to issues that, for one reason or another, drop out of the news because something else has popped up. But I'm grateful to all of you guys being here and telling these stories that so desperately need to be told. I understand focus will shift to different places, but ultimately, as I said, what I see, what I hear, and what I learn is that the vast majority of people, whether you're in the UK or whether you're anywhere else in the world, want to see proper leadership, and they want to see an end to these conflicts, whether that's through diplomacy, however we can bring these conflicts to an end for the sake of everybody now, but also for the future of younger generations coming through.
Do you think any of this is going to have an impact on the big state visit next week?
Any of what?
Any of what you've said here will have an impact on a big state visit?
I don't think so. Not at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Thank you.
The clip you just listened wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It didn't rely on outrage or spectacle. And somehow, that's exactly why it landed. Because in a world that constantly feels like it's teetering on the edge, where every headline screams urgency and every platform thrives on division, what you just heard from Prince Harry felt grounded. What makes this moment stand out isn't just what was said, it's how it was said. There was no performance, no attempt to dominate the conversation, no carefully rehearsed soundbite designed to go viral. Instead, what we saw was someone speaking plainly about a world that is, frankly, not in great shape right now. Wars across multiple regions, civilians suffering on a massive scale, entire communities dealing with trauma that doesn't just disappear when the headlines move on. And instead of pretending everything is under control, he acknowledged something most leaders avoid saying out loud. People are scared, not in a dramatic, exaggerated sense, but in a quiet, underlying way that sits beneath everyday life. That feeling that things are unstable, that something bigger could unravel. And yet, even within that reality, there was something else in his response, something that didn't lean into despair. He pointed out that the vast majority of people don't want this. They don't want endless conflict. They don't want division. They don't want to live in a world where violence becomes normalized background noise. That contrast is powerful because while institutions argue and governments posture and media cycles churn through crisis after crisis, the average person just wants peace. It's simple, almost too simple, and maybe that's why it gets overlooked. But then the conversation shifts. Because of course it does, from global conflict to royal labels. And this is where things get interesting. The question comes in, carefully worded but familiar, the idea of being no longer a working royal, the implication behind it, the framing that has followed him for years. And instead of getting pulled into that narrative, instead of defending or explaining or over-justifying, he just says, no. No hesitation, no long explanation, just no. It's one of the shortest answers in the entire exchange, and somehow it carries the most weight. Because what he's rejecting isn't just a label, he's rejecting the idea that his value or his ability to contribute is defined by a specific institutional role. He follows it up by saying he will always be part of the royal family, and that matters. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in a grounded, matter-of-fact way that refuses to play into extremes. He's not positioning himself as detached. He's not pretending the connection doesn't exist. At the same time, he's clearly operating outside of that traditional framework, and that creates a space that doesn't fit neatly into the categories people prefer. Because people like things to be simple, in or out, loyal or disloyal, working or not working. But reality, especially in situations like this, tends to be more complicated than that. And he leans into that complexity without trying to resolve it for the audience. Instead, he brings the focus back to the work itself. The trips, the people he meets, the issues that don't always stay in the spotlight. That line about how stories drop out of the news because something else has popped up is quietly one of the most important observations in the entire conversation. Because it's true. Attention moves fast, too fast. One crisis replaces another, and the previous one fades, not because it's been resolved, but because it's no longer trending. And in that environment, showing up consistently, continuing to highlight those issues, becomes its own form of impact. Not flashy, not always visible, but necessary. Then comes the part that really cuts through the noise. The idea of speaking truth to power. Now, that phrase gets thrown around a lot. It's often used in dramatic contexts, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes diluted. But here, it's framed in a very specific way. Not as something reserved for politicians, not as something limited to people in official positions, but as something that should be collective, something that everyone should feel able to do. And that's where the conversation shifts from being about one individual to something broader. Because he's not just talking about his own ability to speak. He's questioning why, in today's world, so many people feel like they can't. Why discussing humanitarian crises becomes politicized. Why acknowledging suffering becomes controversial. Why simply pointing out reality can lead to backlash. It's a strange dynamic. On one hand, information is more accessible than ever. On the other, expressing that information, especially when it challenges certain narratives, can feel increasingly restricted. And that tension sits at the center of what he's addressing. The idea that people should feel empowered to speak. Not recklessly, not without thought, but honestly. Because silence, especially in the face of widespread suffering, doesn't solve anything. It just creates distance. Distance between people and reality. Distance between awareness and action. And that's where his message becomes less about status or identity and more about responsibility. Not in a heavy, overwhelming sense, but in a human sense. If you see something, acknowledge it. If something is wrong, don't pretend it isn't. If people are suffering, don't reduce it to background noise. It sounds simple, but in practice, it's not. Because speaking up comes with consequences. Social consequences, professional consequences, public criticism. And that's why so many people choose not to, which makes moments like this stand out. Not because they're perfect, not because they solve anything immediately, but because they push against that silence. And then, just when the conversation has settled into something serious, reflective, and focused, we get the pivot. The sudden shift back to royal optics, the question about whether any of this will affect an upcoming state visit. It's almost jarring. After discussing global conflict, humanitarian crises, and the emotional weight of it all, we're back to event impact. And his response? Short, clear, no. No elaboration, no attempt to connect the two, no interest in turning one into commentary on the other. And that decision matters because it draws a boundary. It separates the conversation about real-world issues from the constant pull of royal narrative framing. It refuses to let one overshadow the other. And in doing so, it keeps the focus where it was originally placed, on the people affected, on the realities being discussed, on the importance of acknowledging what's happening beyond institutional events. That kind of clarity is easy to miss, but it's deliberate. And it reinforces something that runs through the entire exchange. A refusal to be pulled into distractions, a refusal to turn everything into a spectacle, a refusal to reduce complex, serious issues into talking points for something else. And maybe that's why this moment resonates. Because it doesn't try too hard. It doesn't rely on dramatic delivery. It doesn't attempt to dominate the narrative. It just stays grounded. In a media environment that often rewards extremes, that kind of steadiness feels unusual, almost out of place, but also necessary. Because not everything needs to be loud to be impactful. Sometimes what holds attention isn't intensity, it's clarity. And what we saw here was clarity. Clear acknowledgement of global instability, clear emphasis on human impact, clear rejection of limiting labels, clear boundaries between serious issues and superficial framing, and perhaps most importantly, a clear reminder that despite everything, most people want the same thing: an end to conflict, an end to division, a future that doesn't feel constantly uncertain. It's not a revolutionary idea, but it's one that often gets buried under everything else, and bringing it back into focus, even just briefly, has value. Because in a world that moves quickly, that forgets quickly, that shifts attention constantly, moments that slow things down, even just for a few minutes, matter. But they create space. Space to think. Space to reflect. Space to remember what actually matters. And sometimes that's where change begins. Not in the loudest moments, but in the ones that quietly refuse to be ignored. But there's another layer to this that's easy to miss if you're only half listening. Because what made that moment land wasn't just the calm tone or the absence of theatrics. It was the contrast, the sharp, almost uncomfortable contrast between what was being discussed and what we're used to hearing. We're used to polished answers. We're used to carefully managed language. We're used to public figures speaking in a way that says everything and nothing at the same time. And then here comes someone who just says it. Not perfectly, not in some overly refined, media-trained cadence, but honestly enough that you can feel the difference. There's a kind of weight to that honesty, not because it's dramatic, but because it doesn't try to escape the reality of what's happening. It sits in it, it acknowledges it, and it doesn't rush to soften it for comfort. And that's where a lot of people feel uneasy, because we've been conditioned to expect reassurance. We want to hear that things are under control. We want to believe that someone, somewhere has a handle on everything. But when someone steps in and says, actually, things are complicated, things are unstable, And yes, people are worried. It disrupts that expectation. It forces a different kind of engagement. It forces you to actually think. And thinking, as it turns out, is not always the most popular activity online. Now, let's talk about that idea of fear for a second, because it's easy to misinterpret. When he says people are scared, it's not about panic. It's not about chaos in the streets or dramatic breakdowns. It's quieter than that. It's the kind of fear that shows up in small ways, in the way people consume news, in the way conversations shift, in the underlying tension that never quite disappears even in normal moments. It's the sense that the world is carrying a weight it hasn't fully processed. And when you look at the scale of what's happening globally, that makes sense. Entire regions dealing with conflict, families displaced, communities fractured, generations growing up in environments shaped by instability. That doesn't just go away when the camera turns off. And acknowledging that doesn't make someone negative. It makes them aware. But here's where the balance comes in, because alongside that acknowledgement, there was also a quiet insistence on something else, that people still want better, that despite everything, despite the divisions, despite the noise, despite the endless cycles of conflict, there's still a shared desire for peace. And that might sound idealistic to some, but it's actually one of the most grounded observations you can make. Because if you strip away politics, strip away agendas, strip away the constant framing, most people, at a basic human level, want safety. They want stability. They want a future that feels possible. And that doesn't change just because the world feels complicated. If anything, it becomes more important. Now, coming back to the media dynamic for a moment, because it deserves attention. There's something almost automatic about the way serious conversations get redirected. It's like there's an invisible script. Start with a meaningful topic, let it build, let it reach a point where it actually matters, and then pivot, shift the focus, bring it back to something more familiar, something easier to package, something that fits into an existing narrative. In this case, that narrative is the royal framework. Titles, roles, labels. Who's in, who's out, who's doing what, who's allowed to say what. And you can almost feel the shift in energy when that question comes in, because suddenly we're no longer talking about global issues, we're talking about positioning. And that's where his response becomes even more significant, because instead of engaging with that shift, instead of allowing the conversation to be redirected completely, he resists it, not aggressively, not defensively, just firmly. That simple no isn't just an answer, it's a refusal to let the conversation be reduced to a phrase, a refusal to let the complex identity be boxed into a single phrase, a refusal to play along with a narrative that doesn't fully reflect reality. And that kind of refusal is subtle but powerful, because it doesn't create drama, it doesn't escalate tension, it just quietly redirects the focus back to what actually matters. And that's something a lot of people overlook. They expect impact to look loud. They expect it to come with strong reactions, big statements, viral moments. But sometimes impact looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to engage in a way that distorts the conversation. And that's exactly what happens here. Now, let's take a step back and look at the broader picture, because this isn't just about one interview. It's about a pattern of showing up in spaces that aren't always comfortable, a pattern of speaking about issues that don't always stay in the spotlight, a pattern of maintaining a certain level of consistency even when the surrounding narrative keeps shifting. And consistency in this context matters more than people realize, because attention is unreliable. It spikes, it drops, it moves on. But consistent presence creates something different. It builds trust. It builds credibility. It signals that the focus isn't temporary, that it's not tied to a single moment or a single headline. And in a media environment where everything feels temporary, that kind of consistency stands out. It creates a sense of continuity, a sense that the work continues even when the spotlight moves elsewhere. And that brings us back to that earlier point about stories disappearing from the news cycle. Because that's not just an observation, it's a reality that shapes how people understand the world. If something isn't being talked about, it starts to feel distant, less urgent, less immediate, even if on the ground nothing has changed. And that gap between perception and reality is significant because it affects awareness, it affects engagement, it affects whether people continue to care. So when someone continues to highlight those issues, continues to bring attention back to them, continues to remind people that they haven't gone away, that has value, even if it's not always recognized in the moment. Now, let's circle back to the idea of speaking up, because this is where things get a little uncomfortable. In theory, most people agree with it. Speak the truth. Stand up for what's right. Use your voice. It sounds good. It sounds admirable. But in practice, it's complicated. Because speaking up often comes with a cost. It can create tension. It can invite criticism. It can lead to misinterpretation. And in a world where everything is amplified, where every word can be dissected, reframed, and redistributed, that cost feels higher. So people hesitate. They weigh the risks. They consider the potential fallout. And sometimes they choose silence. Not because they don't care, but because they're navigating a system that doesn't always reward honesty. And that's the tension he's pointing to, not in an abstract way, but in a very real, very current way. The idea that people should feel able to speak, but often don't. The idea that important conversations are happening, but are also being limited. The idea that awareness exists, but expression is complicated. And bringing that tension into the open matters, because you can't address something if you pretend it doesn't exist. You can't shift a dynamic if you don't acknowledge it. And that's where this moment becomes more than just an interview. It becomes a reflection of where things stand, of how conversations are shaped, of what gets amplified and what gets redirected. And maybe, just maybe, it also becomes a small push in a different direction. Not a dramatic shift, not a sudden change, but a subtle one. The kind that starts with awareness, the kind that builds over time, the kind that depends on people paying attention and choosing not to look away. Because at the end of the day, that's really what this comes down to. Attention. Where it goes, how it's used, what it focuses on, and what it ignores. And moments like this, the ones that don't rely on spectacle, the ones that don't chase outrage, the ones that stay grounded, they ask something different from the audience. They don't demand reaction, they invite reflection. And reflection takes effort. It requires slowing down. It requires sitting with information instead of immediately reacting to it. It requires resisting the urge to reduce everything into quick judgments. And that's not always easy, but it's necessary. Because without it, everything becomes surface level, everything becomes noise, and nothing really changes. So when a moment like this cuts through that noise, even briefly, it's worth paying attention to. Not because it's perfect, not because it has all the answers, but because it points in a direction that feels a little more grounded, a little more human, a little more focused on what actually matters. And in a world that constantly pulls attention in 100 different directions, that kind of focus is rare. And whether people agree with every word or not, that steadiness, that clarity, that refusal to be pulled into distraction, that's what stays with you, long after the clip ends. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.